One of the ways that people can follow a false morality by false gods or idols is by idolizing words on paper, by considering words on paper to be equivalent to this living God. If words on paper say that they're from God, then they're from God. They just automatically certify themselves, right? Anytime someone writes on a piece of paper, these words are from God, well, you should just believe it, right? Sounds ridiculous, I'm hoping to your ears, and that's because it is ridiculous. And yet, this is actually what most Christians believe. They believe that everything in the book called the Bible, which is actually a collection of multiple books by multiple authors that have been translated by multiple people, and of course, depending on what translation you're reading, it could just be a few translations from the original Aramaic. Aramaic was the language spoken by Jesus, right? It was translated into Greek, right? We have the Hebrew versions, we have English versions, right? And you can have various other languages, right? And each time it's translated by a human, there is the possibility of a mistake being made if you're not considering all of the people that ever do a Bible translation to be God incarnate, right? If you think, I've heard Christians say something like, well, God's hand protects the Bible. What is the precedent for that? Like, when did Jesus ever say, um, in the future, every word that is written about me, you can trust 100%. It will be physically impossible for anyone to misquote me. It will be physically impossible for anyone to write anything false about me. Anytime someone tries to put ink to paper in reference to me or my father, and what they're about to say is incorrect, God will intervene, take the pen out of their hand or have the paper burst into flames. Right? Of course, he never said anything like that. Actually, if you read the end of the book of Revelation, it's interesting because John there speaks to the issue of people altering text, right? He says anyone who alters this will basically face bad consequences, right? So I'm just going to give two or three examples of inaccuracies in the Bible, just in case you find it hard to believe that there could be any mistakes whatsoever. If you've bought into this idol worship of a book by those that want to push, certain doctrines that are in that book, want to push them on you without question, and so they tell you, well, it's from God. So if you question the book, you're questioning God. Right? You're probably familiar with the verse that says, this is supposedly quoting Jesus. I mean, it is quoting Jesus, but I'll explain how it's a mistranslation. Where he says, it would be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it would be for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. That word camel probably stood out to you the first time you heard it, and maybe it still does, as being, a little bizarre, perhaps. Like, wow, a camel? But then again, well, it's just maybe to get the point across that it's impossible. So obviously, a camel can't go through the eye of a needle. So, camels were no doubt common in the area in which Jesus lived. So, okay, maybe he did say camel, right? But if you actually do a little research or just happen to come across this research, that points out that the word for rope and the word for camel were almost identical. So many scholars believe actually what Jesus said was that it's easier for a rope to go through the eye of a needle than a camel. So I believe that's probably true. I think he probably did say rope rather than camel. So this is just a mundane example. In either, in either case, whether what was said was rope or camel, the point remains the same. Although I think rope makes more sense and actually you could argue is more fitting to reality in that perhaps it's not completely impossible for a rope to go through the eye of a needle, right? You could take the bare threads at the end of the rope and go one by one, and eventually you could have the rope go through the eye of the needle, right? In comparison to a camel, in which there's zero possibility, right? So the idea that a rich man could enter the kingdom of heaven, but it's extremely difficult, actually fits more with Jesus's ministry than this idea that it's completely impossible. But again, this is not of such major consequence. But there are other examples that have much more dire consequences when the mistranslation is believed in. But I'll give another mundane example quickly here, and that's um, the verse or verses that say that John the Baptist ate locusts. Actually, there was another word that was referring to a kind of bread that was eaten at that time that would be equivalent to what today we call basically like a pancake, and that it's much more likely that what he actually was saying was, or what they were saying about John was that he was eating this simple kind of bread, right? And that would make more sense too, fitting in with the time and place, right? Eating a simple form of bread was extremely common in comparison to someone choosing this one particular insect, locust, as their source of nutrition, which obviously would be much more difficult to come across than making a simple bread as well. And right, it just makes more sense that, especially when the words, when side by side, were almost identical, to come to the conclusion, well, this was probably just a mistake in translation. The original Aramaic was probably referring to this type of bread, just like it was probably referring to a rope rather than a camel. So I just bring these to your attention to open you to the possibility that mistranslations are possible, right? And perhaps there's even a language today that the Bible hasn't been translated into, or maybe just recently, this past year or something. That there was some kind of very little known language, that the Bible hadn't been translated into, and it just was. Are you again going to believe that whoever's doing that translation from, say, English to whatever that other language is, that it's impossible for them to make any errors whatsoever? Right? If you are saying that, well, you're thinking that this person is divine, right? Infallible, right? Perfect, incapable of mistake. All right, so now I'm going to talk about another verse that has much more dire consequences. A mistranslation. What I believe is definitely a mistranslation that has had much more negative consequences than the mistranslations of the word rope and bread. And that is the verse in what's called the Sermon on the Mount, wherein Jesus says to turn the other cheek. Right? This has become like the foundation of many people's moral view. Right? This complete, or you could say extreme pacifism that does not believe in self-defense. Right? No self-defense force. If someone is abusing you or being violent, you should just take it. You should literally, yeah, turn the other cheek, right? Whatever. Just give your body over to them to be abused. And that's what Jesus wanted, is what this verse is saying in the way that it's been translated, right? And just consider for a moment the possibility, just hypothetically speaking here to start with, that this verse is actually incorrect. Who might like the fact that this mistranslation exists? Who might like the idea of billions of people believing self-defense is a bad thing? Who would think that? Right? Would the average person, if you ask the average person on the street, do you think self-defense is bad? Like if a woman is being attacked and she defends herself, do you think that's bad? Do you think she should just, roll over or turn the other cheek? I think it's safe to say most people would say, well, no, if she used some defensive force to try and save herself or protect herself, that's okay. Or, say someone is going to harm your child. Do you think most parents would say, well, I'm not going to stop them. I'm just going to watch them hurt my child in front of me. I don't think so. I don't think most parents would say that, right? Does this mean that they go against Jesus? No, it doesn't, because it's a mistranslation. If you actually look into the words and the original language, you can find that not even having to go back to the original Aramaic, but just to the Greek, an equally valid translation of turn the other cheek is actually return. Turn is actually return. And instead of the other cheek, it's one of the same kind. So return to them one of the same kind. Return to them likewise. So he was saying, not only eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but if someone even just slaps you on the cheek, return to them likewise. He wasn't contradicting the original law, he was refining it, which happens to fit his whole ministry, where he said exactly that he came not to, destroy or contradict the law, but to clarify it, basically, right? And it also fits the rest of that passage there, where he's saying, even if you lust, or even if you let anger come over you, you've sinned. Right? He's refining the law. He's pointing out even these more subtle things are important to keep in mind. So millions, if not billions of people have at the least been confused by this verse that seems to say that you should never defend yourself if someone is being violent towards you, all because of what to me is a clear mistranslation. I mean, I spent maybe 10 minutes looking at the Greek, and it was clear as day. And yet, this has been, considered truth. This mistranslation has been considered truth from the mouth of God for centuries, and is still considered so today. Why? Because people haven't even quite, they're not even open to the possibility of it being a mistake, even if it seems odd to them. The word camel strikes them as odd, or the word locust, or Jesus saying to turn the other cheek, maybe it doesn't seem right to them. But if they have this meta belief that this book is divine, and so therefore anything that's this book says, anything in the book is therefore perfect, then they're going to fall for false morality, false teachings that are within that book, and that's going to mislead them, right? It's the same old story, going all the way back to Adam and Eve. The devil on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, corrupting that knowledge. Again, doesn't mean there isn't any true knowledge of good and evil, and that God doesn't want us to have that true knowledge. Obviously, he does. Right? That's what the Ten Commandments was about. That's what Jesus' ministry was in large part about, right? Repeatedly giving a moral teaching, right? Pointing us to the greatest commandments. To say that God doesn't want us to have the true knowledge of good and evil is just absurd. And yet, again, Christians are at the very least confused on their morality because of this teaching. And the only reason they are is because they just take it for granted that it's perfectly accurate, because they idolize the book and they idolize all the authors in the book. They're violating the first commandment to have no idols. Paul is perhaps the ultimate example. Paul, I believe, is definitely a false apostle and actually worthy of the title Antichrist. Paul said that for a slave to obey his master is to do the will of God. Right? Paul said that to obey government is to obey the will of God. Right? So all of these insane, mass murdering, horrible, you know, government leaders and dictators throughout history who have done, the worst atrocities, we're supposed to believe that this is all God's will. It's blasphemous, right? And to say that God condones slavery, right? Paul was saying to slaves, what we would think of here in the States, comes to mind, African American slavery, right? Slaves like that, on a physical level, that, and this was actually communicated to the slaves, right, by the slave owners on these plantations, right? They would read these verses of Paul to the slaves and tell them, this is God's will, right? And likewise, you hear about in Christian and I guess Muslim history, various cultures or whatever, where they have this belief like that God wills them to do some massacre, right? They go through a town, massacre all the people. Perhaps that happened with some deranged people who thought it was God's will to like massacre Native Americans, right? They come to a town, with women and children, and they get the crazy idea in their head. Well, God's will is to clear the land of this heathen, something like that. And so they commit immense abuse in the name of God, right? And this is how dangerous idol worship is. You can participate in abuse, which again is the opposite of love, right? And the commandments are to love comprehensively, right? So you're violating the commandments of Jesus. Jesus, who, remember, said to sin no more, who also said that unless your righteousness is exceedingly high, you will by no other means enter the kingdom of heaven. And that includes saying a prayer given to you on a pamphlet, by the way. And who also said to be perfect like your heavenly Father is perfect, right? Ignore all of those moral teachings, right? Because Paul says it doesn't matter. All you got to have is faith in a blood sacrifice ritual. And you can trust Paul. Why? Because Paul says so. Paul says he's divine. So therefore he's divine. Right? Appeal to authority, right? In logical fallacy terms. You have this perceived authority, so you just assume that whatever they say is true and correct. The appeal to authority, logical fallacy, is basically idol worship whenever you commit that fallacy. So again, it's the same theme from the beginning. Satan on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, contaminating that knowledge, right? It's, again, not that all knowledge or the true knowledge of good and evil is bad, but the contaminated knowledge, right? He's on that tree. That is the worm in the apple. That contaminated knowledge of good and evil is what we should not eat of. And if we do, we shall surely die. We shall surely spiritually die, face destruction. And that's exactly what's been happening. People have been eating the fruit from the trees of false gods, and it's been keeping humanity out of paradise ever since, right? That tree with the serpent on it can also be a book with an antichrist in it. It can also be a mass media outlet with, satanic owners spewing their misinformation, or it can be a social media site, where some supposed, you know, social justice activist is giving you a list of um, points of resistance, points of righteousness, which include, eat meat and, love your country, i.e., love the government, right? Slipped in propagandistically, right? So you just assume it's all good because it's coming from your idol. You ingest the false morality from the false God, and you're led to destruction. That's been the theme. It continues to be the theme. And I hope you and others will wake up to that and start referencing the true morality, the true living God, and focus on what was pointed to us as the greatest commandment, to love God, love others, and love ourselves. Right? And focus on the true teachings of Jesus, not these mistranslations. And focus on the Holy Spirit, which I believe is synonymous with what we call intuition. This personal guidance. Right? Guidance, which, by the way, will never be guiding you to abuse others, whether those others are animals or people, because, again, God is perfectly good, doesn't advocate abuse, doesn't participate in abuse, which is why we have free will, by the way, right? Because if we didn't, that would be abusive control. Abusively controlling people's bodies, like, say, I don't know, in the form of medical tyranny, where you have to take whatever pharmaceutical drug a politician wants you to, or put whatever medical device they want you to put on your face, and your children's face. Abusive control like that, coming from these abusive false gods that people go along with, right? Believing their false morality. Obedience is virtue, right? All this Orwellian morality. Slavery is freedom. Obedience is virtue. War is peace, right? So I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for listening.